Good afternoon, everyone. I'll start my preamble while our registrants are joining us here today. Uh, Again, thanks for joining us. This is our second last webinar of our 10-part community resilience series. We've got two really interesting speakers here today, and what I'd like to do is after Scott and David share with us their views on sector opportunities, I'd like to open it up to an audio conversation for our guests that want to pose a question. Just indicate in the chat function that you have a question, and then we'll ask you to unmute yourself so you can actually have a dialogue with our presenters. I think that would work well given the subject matter and given some of the questions that might come up today. So just indicate by chat at the end of the presentations today, and then we'll ask you to unmute. But otherwise, we ask you to stay muted and to keep your video muted throughout the presentations. So our first presenter today is going to be Scott Bryan. Brian's a senior, Scott is a senior partner with WabTech. It's a strategy and investment attraction firm. Scott's worked with over 200 economic development officers and investment attraction agencies around the world to craft his skills over the last 19 years. So we're thrilled to have Scott with us today, and he has done some work here in Saskatchewan. And then our second presenter is David McLean. David is Vice President of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association. He's based in Edmonton and a native of Fort McMurray himself. So we're going to let Scott present first, and we'll reconnect with you, David, following his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Verona, and thank you everybody for joining today. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in video. I get some feedback when trying to do the video and audio, but at the same time, you're welcome because you don't have to see me in my COVID haircut, so I think it's actually to benefit. That being said, I have a brief presentation for you today. It's brief but comprehensive. I intend to maybe dig in on a few of the slides in more detail, and the other ones I'll leave as kind of reference material that you can go back over. And if you have questions, you can always approach me to discuss. So we'll kick things off. Here's kind of the lay of the land of what I'm going to tackle. First, it's very important that we look at some of the trends happening both in Canada and then in Saskatchewan, looking at foreign direct investment and then direct domestic investment, seeing how the flows of domestic investment are happening from province to province, as well as within Saskatchewan. And then going to look at the impact of trade, because that's also very important as well. Then we'll dig into what everybody's probably joined the call for, which is the actual investment opportunities and how to reshore supply chain and what to look at. And then want to touch on how corporations are considering foreign direct investment and where they're looking and what their drivers might be. And then, of course, how we can possibly assist you with these activities. So the first section, going to look at the FDI market. So how is things kind of going to be transforming over the next little while in the foreseeable future? The charts are pretty self-explanatory, so I won't run through them in too much detail here, but as you can see, we've taken a hit, and the forecast is that while there will be some growth, it won't be to previous levels. I think that's no surprise to anyone. However, there will still be some significant growth, and that means there's opportunities for you to take advantage of. So really the key here is to focus in on when the growth is happening and be ready for it and positioned, which means getting your assets in place, your brand in place, and making sure you can take advantage. So these two slides I'm about to show you look at greenfield FDI into Canada from January to April. And FYI, the April numbers are still live and being sorted out, so it's not fully finished. But I want to just make that clear. The next two slides after this will be looking at the actual expansions from foreign firms already in Canada. So this is net new investment. The next two slides will be existing investors that are foreign that have been expanded over the last 4 months, not including May, obviously. So we can see here in terms of the market share, there was about 60 greenfield FDI projects, I should say, coming to Canada from January to April. The value of this was around $3.1 billion in terms of the capex, and it created about 4,000 jobs. Interestingly, February was the strongest month, had about 22 projects, dropping to about just 5 in April, with the capex going down from $1 billion to $100 million. Now, it's interesting here where you see that the majority of the destination for these projects was into Ontario, with BC then getting the rest of the lion's share, followed by Alberta and Quebec. There was no FDI, at least publicly recorded, that we could find at this time that was into the province of Saskatchewan. In terms of the source regions, very clear from the side, you see the US, obviously the dominant market. And if you actually pull together all the European nations that were source markets for these investments into Canada, it still doesn't total the magnitude of the market share for the US. And it's also no surprise there, given our trade relationship and proximity with the US. Moving to the next slide. In terms of the market share, this is a breakdown of the top 20 sectors as well as top 10 subsectors. Didn't want to do top 20 subsectors simply because it would fill your screen and it would be hard to read. So I'll bring a few things to your attention on this slide that can help you kind of get an idea of what we're looking at. Clearly, digital services dominate the investment landscape, and that makes a lot of sense because it's delivered remotely, not subject to customs and border control, and can get around a lot of supply chain issues. And most importantly, businesses right now during COVID are facing a lot of novel issues that require digital services to get them through the pandemic. So there's no surprise here that this is happening, and it will probably continue to be the case, as we'll discuss a little bit later. For these slides now, we're going to look at expansions that have been happening with foreign firms. So again, not greenfield investment, but firms that are already in market, already in Canada, that have chosen to continue to expand during January to April. And in that realm of thought, there was about 24 FDI expansion projects, and 50% of these actually happened in February. So after that, there was a lot of drop-off, and it went down to about 8% in April. Again, the April numbers are not finalized, but it's still pretty indicative of the trauma that we received in terms of the BR&E and aftercare for the impact on expansion projects from foreign firms. Once again, you can see Ontario leading the way, but this time followed by Quebec, which is also not surprising given their focus point. They put a lot of effort from Investissement Québec into aftercare and helping companies grow. And to the right side, you can see the terms of the business activity. I want to point your attention to manufacturing, making up 20% of what's been happening. So that's key. And then, of course, business services, which gets back into software and IT and things of that nature. Again, on this side, looking at FDI expansion, so firms already in the market that are foreign that decide to expand. Here's a breakdown of the sector and then the subsectors. So clearly, IT is also leading the way once again with business services. And then if you look to the right and the left as well, you can see a bit of mix, which would be very interesting for Saskatchewan, from some minerals, metals, chemicals, even some aircraft engines and other parts. And even though, Saskatchewan doesn't really dominate in the aircraft space, as with some other provinces, it is somewhere where it could focus on for agricultural aircraft. And we can get into that a bit more later. So just a few points here for you to see about kind of what the FDI recovery might look like. The uniform will not be uniform, I should say, and some key factors that will be driving it. So obviously one will be declining or low COVID-19 numbers in Canada and your region respectively in Saskatchewan, good measures you're putting in place, and easily retrievable information for investors to see that other businesses are at the forefront of helping to ensure social distancing and safety. The next item is regards to target markets, so outside of Canada or even inside as well. When looking at target markets such as the US, the UK, France, and Germany, you need to look and consider things such as, are they allowing flights into Canada for business meetings and doing familiarization tours, things of that nature. The third point is a really specific one that's very important, and we'll get into a bit later, and it's around specialization. Your FDI recovery specifically is going to be a lot faster if you have a competitive advantage and you specialize. And one thing I can point to is manufacturing. Almost over the last 10 years, but specifically because I don't have the numbers yet, from about 2010 to 2018, Saskatchewan received about 25% of all of its foreign direct investment in the manufacturing sector. So clearly very specialized there. And, in terms of farm and industrial equipment, mining equipment, things of that nature. And finally, you need to consider policies. So keep an eye out on the US and the UK especially, not simply on whether they open borders, but they try to introduce new protocols, constraints, but as well opportunities. So travel bubbles where certain regions or sectors are authorized to travel. This will be very important to keep in mind. So now we're going to look at impact on the DDI market. So this is the domestic market. And specifically, I put some slides together that just focus on Saskatchewan, but I will talk a bit about Canada as a whole and what we're seeing there. So specifically here, these are Saskatchewan-based companies born out of Saskatchewan, headquartered in Saskatchewan, that have made investments. They've done new investments between January and April. So what have we been seeing? So we've seen about 14 projects from January to April. Again, April numbers are not fully finalized. And those numbers since January were steadily decreasing. Interestingly, though, the CapEx was about $7 million in March, and then they quadrupled into April with $30 million, even though there was only one project announced. And just to give you some order of magnitude and perspective, nationally speaking for Canada, we saw about 860 domestic investment projects between January and April, with about $14 billion in terms of CapEx, with about 34,000 jobs. And contrary to intuition, the spike of that was actually in March. We saw 342 projects in March, creating 13,000 jobs, while April dropped to about $5 billion CapEx with only 42 projects. So clearly, there was a lot of differential happening. And also worth noting here, as you can see from the screen on the right-hand side, for Saskatchewan, nearly 80% of its inward domestic investment, it's coming from the West Coast, while 40% of that investment, or roughly 40%, a little bit more, is happening within the province itself. So your local companies that you're supporting to grow in your respective regions. Here's a breakdown of the market share by sector and subsector, and this is according to NICS codes. And by the way, where it says all DDI projects in the small bracket underneath, that simply means new projects that have created from companies based in Saskatchewan, and expansion projects from companies that are already there in Saskatchewan and decide to expand further, but all headquartered in Saskatchewan. So as you can see here, a lot of retail and wholesale, and this is not surprising given that there's a lot of demand for food and other services like that. But still, we also see a good bit of other things that we want to keep in mind. I'll draw your attention to the fact that 28% of the investment was in manufacturing, if you break it down by food, beverage, and chemical. So these are areas you'll want to pay attention to in terms of investment opportunities for the supply chain. So now I'm going to look at the impact of COVID on trade. I only have one slide here, but I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on it. And the reason being is that there's a symbiotic relationship between trade and foreign direct investment, as well as direct domestic investment as well. And the key thing here is that when you have a strong concentration of exports, it gives you a competitive advantage. And even if you have a strong base of imports, that allows you to do import substitution. It provides a business case for a potential foreign company. Overall, here we're seeing that the total exports were about $2.5 billion in April, while imports were $840 million. And this is just for the province. And what I'm going to do now is just spot shadow a few areas where we saw some spikes that I think are interesting to note, where we can look at their supply chains and what could be done specifically. So I'll draw your attention to vegetable products. That's a 25% spike in exports. Then the next big one you'll see there, the biggest one on the screen, is prepared foodstuffs, beverages, and tobacco. 70% hike in exports. Also, we look at machinery and mechanical appliances, electrical equipment. That had a 14% hike in exports. And this is year over year, so from last year to now. And then finally, we look at chemical products or allied industries, which had an 18% bump in imports. So not exports, but imports. But again, think import substitution through foreign direct investment. Also worth noting the volumes, because you got to put things in proportion. Vegetable products was worth $1.2 billion in exports. Chemicals, $685 million in exports, $191 million in imports. So perhaps that was supporting some of the export market. So now we're going to start looking at some of the actual investment opportunities and how to go about this. Investment opportunities in terms of what you can do in your respective jurisdiction to help companies, but then also what the companies themselves can do. So here are some of these structural changes that are going to impact investment that you need to keep in mind. Some of these won't be surprising, others maybe so. So one is going to be low-scale workforce displacement, which basically just means there's going to be more automation happening. And with the digitization trends we're seeing, that's not surprising. And then, of course, social distancing is going to push us to have more hygiene, more health products, and that will be supported as well by e-commerce growth because people will want to be online more, but also access some of the products they need. I won't run through every single one here as some are very self-explanatory, but I will put some time to focus on the ESG, environmental, social, and governance. This one is very important because this is going to be something that companies are looking more and more to align with. And I'll get a bit more into sustainable investments a little bit down the road, but this is key for two reasons. One, it aligns to their strategies, but also it's been proven that through sustainable investments, companies can actually be more profitable. So 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't the case. You had a CSR focused on green, environmentally friendly. It was typically not helping your bottom line. That has actually changed now. So what do you need to do? Some of this you've already been doing, some perhaps not. One is clearly focused on the aftercare. While we do tout that FDI is a key component of finding new growth and innovation and creating new jobs, the majority of the actual boost economy typically comes from your existing investors. They're the ones that expand intra-jurisdictionally. So reinvestment is going to be key, expansion, development of existing investors. That means supporting them in their supply chain and skills development. We have some material on that you can check out at the link. The next one is going to be targeting growth sectors. That's part of the reason why we showed some of these trends to show you what's happening. You probably don't want to be focusing on sectors that are decaying right now. You want to focus on the ones that have a growth trajectory that's looking positive and spiked above last year. The next thing is reshoring. You probably heard a lot about this, especially coming out of the US media. So a lot of companies want to get their supply chains closer physically to where they are, or possibly bringing it back on the ground to where they are. And we'll discuss this in a bit more detail. And I do also want to highlight the risks because this has been, a really hot topic, and everyone's looking to reshore and localize supply chains, and that's great. It's fantastic. But there are inherent risks with that you need to watch out for. So I want to speak to some of those a bit later. I won't spend too much time on this because there's not as many that's going to be applicable for Saskatchewan, but depending on where your region is and the companies you have, it might be more so. But these are the top 12 growth subsectors for FDI that we're seeing in the next year. So from e-commerce down to clean tech, med tech, obviously. I would say for Saskatchewan from this list, a big focus will be on Industry 4.0, AI, smart logistics, and quite possibly even cybersecurity as well.
Sorry about that, Scott. I'm just fixing up your presentation. It appeared like we were maybe a slide or two behind.
Oh, no problem.
Just one moment.
I'll grab a water.
There you are. You can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I didn't realize I was a few slides behind, but or you were a few slides behind. Hopefully what I said made sense. So I was mentioning on this previous slide, these are the global top growth sectors for the next year. And there was a specific focus that I think made sense for Saskatchewan, that being Industry 4.0, AI, smart logistics, clean tech, possibly even cybersecurity. That doesn't mean some of the other ones are not. Again, it depends on your respective jurisdiction, the companies you have there, your assets in terms of your education institutions, and the talent and their skill sets. But important to note these because there might be some that you can piggyback on, and some of these subsectors might be converging with some of your existing subsectors. So now we're going to jump into some potential opportunities for Saskatchewan in terms of supply chain where you can develop. So as you'll see here, what I've done is I looked at some focus areas based on Stats Canada's merchandise commodity categories. And then I looked at the FDI trends, domestic trends coming into Canada and Saskatchewan, and I looked at trade. And I basically triangulated everything, and I looked for where there was overlap to support why you might want to invest in these areas. So the first one being vegetable products. What could possibly be done in your supply chains here to boost this? Because for a large part, there's just exported commodities that are happening, and it can be done more efficiently. So I was thinking ag tech, have smart sensors, autonomous tractors, things of that nature, and R&D for testing. Bringing in new companies or expanding current companies you have and their available services to perform these activities will deepen and thicken your supply chain. And the reason why this could make sense is on the right. You've got export growth incredibly in the vegetable and product sector, and that's probably not going to go anywhere because in recession, people generally and consumers and businesses will cut down on luxury spends, but we all need to eat. We need food. And Saskatchewan feeds the world. So this is a good place to focus on the start. As you can see, software and IT had the #1 market share for Greenfield FDI and also #2 for FDI expansions. And then a big one here, probably the most impressive about all this, is that the province is the largest exporter of agri-food products. 40% of Canada's cultivated farmland, plus you have a globally ranked #1 university in the top 300, specifically in agriculture and forestry. So you got the talent pipeline to support all this. All of this equals the perfect test bed for R&D. And what's beautiful about R&D is that two things: brings in a lot of money, brings in innovation, and creates high-paying jobs, and that spurs other jobs and other innovation. So it's a great focal point that I think can be really leveraged here, is to focus on the R&D side, which is already happening, but more can be done. For the next item, prepared foodstuffs, beverages, value-added manufacturing. This is really kind of the name of the game. Already have a lot being done in the province, but a lot more can be done. Again, to support the export growth, you have there domestic investment, 14% of it, which was in food and beverage manufacturing. So clearly there's an appetite, pardon the pun. Retail and wholesale trade, #1 market share for direct investment domestically in Saskatchewan. And that's important because that's where the products are getting sold. So that's your end market. Then you have food manufacturing, #4 in terms of market share. It shares that ranking, but it's #4. And then also you have the Saskatchewan value-added agriculture incentive. So you have some incentives that are already existing to support companies in expanding their capabilities to add on value-added manufacturing to their process. So to provide a product that has basically more value, but add something else, which means adding another link in the supply chain. Following this, we have chemical products or allied industries. Now, this one was more import focused, and I'll get into that in a second. Some of the areas where I was thinking about, because of all the beautiful crops that you have and vegetables, things of that nature, was around bio-based products, whether it's fuels and things and whatnot, and of course fertilizers. Then you have your traditional chemical fertilizers that are used in production or as lubricants in manufacturing and things of that nature. As I mentioned, we did recognize there was some import growth here that was probably supporting the export growth. Chemical manufacturing, #4 ranking in terms of the market share in domestic investment. And also Saskatchewan has the end market consumer right there, that being the agriculture production. So that's why companies want to invest in the province, knowing that they can sell direct to market right there. And you're an export-oriented province as well. And I mentioned that stat previously about, from 2010 to 2018, a quarter of the investment was into the manufacturing sector. And finally, we have machinery and mechanical appliance, et cetera. Big place here for, I think, farm or mining equipment manufacturing, including autonomous equipment. Again, this will blend into some of those top 12 growth subsectors, as well as mining. Specifically, I'm thinking green mining as well, and mineral processing. So again, this is supported by export growth. You've got software and IT for the autonomous equipment. That's #1 market share for greenfield investment, and #2 in terms of market share for FDI expansions. And then you have industrial equipment, which was #5 market share for FDI expansions. I'm just going to move to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about the potential for supply chain reshoring or nearshoring. So whether it's bringing it right back into Canada or bringing it close by companies or wherever those companies, I should say, exist, and whether or not they need to focus into Saskatchewan and what they need to look at. So from a corporate perspective, here's what the companies are generally considering. We've heard this enough, diversifying the supply chains to reduce risk. So not just in one country. Okay, we know about that already. The next thing is multi-source key commodities for strategic components. So this could be very important because it could mean changing the manufacturing process as well, depending on the quality of these commodities and what is the time and order magnitude it is to get them into the market and the state they're in, or if any other processing is happening before they get there. Also, there might be some inventory strategies you want to see to buffer against supply chain disruption. So maybe firms will be looking to have more put into storage nearby, or perhaps they want to set up contracts where they're ordering more in volume in certain timeframes, things of that nature. And this is important because when we talk about, bringing companies and reshoring companies, we've got to understand that these companies already have contracts in place. They may not be able to break them, or they might be, but we need to look at how these contracts are already set up and what might be possibilities down the road. And speaking of which, that also gets into the strong preferential relationships with key suppliers. That's going to be an important factor. If you already have some of the key suppliers in your market or an ability to get them, this will support attracting some of their clients and partners. And lastly, a system to provide visibility and planning across the supply chain. This is going to be huge. That's why logistics came up as one of the top 12 subsectors. This is going to be massive for companies and helping them, not just in their planning and their forecasting, but also in their disaster recovery. And lastly, there's going to be a need for agility with production and the distribution networks. So right now, we're seeing that there's an evolution happening with how things are being produced, and companies need to get more nimble as per the agility. So it's going to be interesting where this ends up, but there could be a role to be had with some of the local companies providing some of that agility. So maybe they can be for just-in-time manufacturing, or short run cycle manufacturing, or something else. Here's just a bit around the outlook and where we see some things happening. So for one, FDI is going to have a slow recovery, obviously, but should get back up and running around Q4. Not to say you won't see it before that, but it's going to be a lot healthier around then. But really, we're seeing that Q1 2021 is when we expect greenfield FDI to be around the 35% lower than Q1 of 2019, but still up. So the key focus here is there will be growth. And the real opportunities to seize around your existing foreign investors. And again, targeting the high growth sectors and supply chain reshoring. Also, FDI and exports are highly concentrated. So what that means is it's going to be a challenge targeting regions where they're known, they have the brand and the capability for not only developing products, but exporting them. So think of manufacturing, which is generally dominated by the US, Germany, China, and Japan. You really need to carve out your niche and how you can differentiate, and then approach the companies that are in that space to further develop either their product or access customers in your region. Number 4, while FDI is remapped based more on market size and potential, each region in the world will be regionalizing its supply chains. And as mentioned here, the US is a big market to focus on, which is great for us in Canada because it's our largest trading partner. And a lot of our FDI is coming from there, especially in Saskatchewan. And the last thing is around subsidies, so incentives and whatnot, and things to help companies out getting through the process, but also trying to stay competitive. While it's important to do this, it can distort, the market and how competitive businesses really are, and that's why we feel it's much more important, not much more important, but it's more important to look at how to invest in promoting your region and workforce skills and development and supplier development programs, because this is stuff that was required before, during COVID, and it will be required after COVID. There's a war on talent, and as industries are shifting, new skills will be required. And as we're developing new supplier networks, the existing suppliers will need to develop the skill sets and the tools to deal with that. So reinforcing that, we think, is going to be a very smart play to help build out the competitiveness of your region. So just some reminders of kind of what's going on and where you need to, focus on, if you will. FDI, fundamentally market seeking, and will gravitate to growth poles of the economy. So what that means is, number one, generally speaking, FDI is looking for a market access to sell to and markets that are growing. Growth could be in terms of GDP or growth in terms of their sales, as well as access to other markets. So if you have a foreign company, say in Germany, they might actually want to set up in Canada because it's, say, lower cost, but also gives them access to the US. These are places where, quote unquote, Saskatchewan can have a strong play. Again, reshoring supply chains, companies will be looking for trusted suppliers in other regions of the world. And you can see here how we think this might play out in terms of the breakouts and the timing it might take for that. Also, many sectors are going to be very challenging, especially with high tech, for local firms to meet the needs of foreign suppliers to invest, just because of specialized skills and specific site selection requirements. So it's something you need to keep in mind. So while you might see, a sector that looks very interesting, you have to think, well, who's the competition and how are you relative to the competition? This is very, very important. And lastly, while there is an opportunity for diversification away from big markets for manufacturing like China and Germany, Japan, Korea, Switzerland, we do need to keep in mind that, again, the relative strength is the most important thing here, and it might not be worth the investment in going after these number one priority, let's say top sector growth markets. There might be another market that makes more sense based on your relative strength. If you can really stand out, then you have a business case for these investors to expand already in your region or into your region. And this is just to give you an idea of what's been happening in terms of the market size of countries and regions and the growth we think we're going to see in the next kind of few years span. So you see the Asia Pacific, North America, and the rest of the world on the right-hand side. So clearly North America, we're dipping down, but it's still relatively healthy in the long-term future or mid to long-term in the next few years out, which is good. But as you can see, we're going to have a lot of competition from Europe as well as the rest of the world, while Asia is going to be a dominant market. So that needs to be factored into your strategy and how you're approaching investors and understanding your relative strength. So in terms of future FDI plans, this is a breakdown of companies and the percentage of those that are looking at different regions of the world for expansion. We looked at February to April of 2019. Then we looked at February to April of this year. Now, this is based on investor signals, so things like press releases or anything we could find where companies were signaling that they were looking to invest or move into a new market based on a business case in their sector, et cetera. And based on these signals that we received, here's what we saw. So clearly, Europe was the dominant for 2019. As we shipped to February and April 2020, it's starting to drop, and Asia Pacific is starting to pick up, as is North America. So very good for us, and we need to play onto this. Just one last slide here around some things that we can do to help, but generally speaking, it's important for you to think about whether or not, WAFTEC is supporting you. You need to look at your current strategy, what's in place right now, and make sure you're revisiting this quite frequently. I would say at this point, it needs to be done at least every 2 or 3 months with maybe a 1-month pulse. But your 2021 strategy needs to be put in place right now. Now is the perfect time as the markets are opening up, both your foreign direct investment strategy and your domestic direct investment strategy, looking at your local firms and how you're going to help them grow or bring in new ones. And part of that also has to entail your value propositions, because that needs to change. How is your value proposition in the wake of COVID? Is it A, realistic, B, relevant, and C, is it still impactful? So you need to revisit those, because what happened before does not translate to now. There are some things that you can bring forward, but some that you cannot. So you need to revisit those. Strategic corporate intelligence, you need to get the data. So you need to make sure you get out there and find as much data as you can to help you inform your decisions. And then lead generation. Ideally, you'll be meeting with investors in person. As this is going to be happening maybe a bit further down the road, start doing it virtually right now, because it doesn't happen overnight that investors are going to show up and do a familiarization tour. You need to have those meetings virtually, get the interest out there, understand the requirements, and most importantly, understand what the triggers are for them to invest and build your business case around that. And then lastly, whether you have the capacity to do it locally or perhaps with the assistance of the province or with Invest in Canada, in-market reps, find people that can represent you in the regions you're targeting. Part of the reason you might want to do that is because A, they have networks, B, they're going to speak the local languages and understand the customs, and C, they might have already worked with these companies and know how to navigate their corporate culture, if you will, to get to the decision makers and help convince them to come set up in Saskatchewan. And that is it for my presentation. I thank you guys for being patient with me, and I hope I didn't rush through it too much, but I did want to give my colleague time for his presentation, and I open the floor up for some questions. And if not, David, good luck.
Please stay on. Please stay with us, Scott, until after David presents, and we'll address questions. Thanks again. That was fairly positive, actually, fairly positive view of Saskatchewan and very comprehensive. So, Logan, maybe we'll let we'll take down the slides and let David take full stage. Thanks so much, David, for being with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, and unfortunately for our audience today, they have to look at me. I'm not using any visuals. You guys will let me know if the audio isn't working properly. But anyway, my name's David McLean. Thank you for having me here today. I'm the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Divisional Vice President for Saskatchewan and Alberta. CME is a national association. We represent manufacturers across and exporters across the country. We've been around for 150 years. We were the voice of manufacturers before the turn of the last century. We helped manufacturers through the First World War, the Great Depression, post-World War II boom. And frankly, we've never seen anything like we're seeing today. And in Saskatchewan, it has been written time and again, but it bears repeating that the province has been hit by an economic perfect storm. It might be kind of underappreciated that manufacturing is a major driver in the Saskatchewan economy. Saskatchewan has 1,900 manufacturers. They generate about $16.2 billion in sales. That's in 2019. That represented in that year 6.4% of the GDP. Last year, the sector employed about 31,000 people, generally good paying jobs. Manufacturing workers are paid about a 15% premium compared to other sectors. And when we look at indirect employment created by manufacturing in the province, we're talking about 120,000 jobs. And that number grew significantly between 2018 and 2019. And I'll kind of work my way through some of the manufacturing trends right now. The manufacturing story in Saskatchewan has been a very, very good one for the last 15 years. Since 2005, manufacturing sales have risen more than 50%. We have seen dips. The 2008 financial crisis hammered the sector sales, and it took 2 years to recover from 2008. So we saw the dip in 2008 and then subsequent dip in 2009 and 2010. But from 2011 to 2014, we saw a dramatic increase in sales. The oil and gas downturn, of course, a lot of Saskatchewan manufacturers are part of the energy supply chain. But the oil and gas downturn that began in 2014 really had an impact. But then between 2016 and 2018, we saw this exceptional growth in manufacturing once again. Last year was an outlier. It was a very weird year. We saw a significant decline because of another number of factors. First, well, maybe not in no particular order, steel and aluminum tariffs really hit hard, really hit the sector hard, really hit our overall competitiveness as a jurisdiction hard. The trade dispute with China, of course, was a really big factor as well. While every province in 2019 saw manufacturing sales hold roughly steady, Saskatchewan again was an outlier. Dramatic 9.2% decline year over year in 2019. Total exports to Saskatchewan's largest trading partner also saw a big hit. Exports to the US last year, they declined by 4.8%. Exports to China declined by a crazy 32%. But despite all those headwinds and an exceptionally rough 2019, Saskatchewan's manufacturing output, the overall health of the sector coming into the pandemic was close to our all-time high. So things were very strong. Despite all the challenges that the sector faced, things were looking fairly good from a historical perspective. This month's job numbers are horrific. In March of 2019, Saskatchewan manufacturing sales came in at about 1.37 billion. That was last year. This year, 1.18 billion. That's a significant, albeit expected, 13% decline year over year. I've been in extremely close contact with Saskatchewan manufacturers since the beginning of the pandemic. And what I hear as recently as this week is that things are all right. They continue to work through orders. Not all manufacturers have laid off staff. Certainly some have, particularly those exposed to the oil and gas sector. But there is one particularly bright spot. I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know, but ag implement manufacturing is a growing concern, I guess. I guess you could say. Naturally, crops are going to be planted. Farmers around the world need equipment, and the Canadian dollar has absolutely cratered, which is a great benefit to Saskatchewan manufacturing exporters. We had one CME member hired 50 floor staff in Regina at the end of April, and they received something like 200 applications overnight when they posted the job. So by and large, manufacturers of all stripes should see a decline in demand for their products, and that effect is not acutely being felt right now. We believe that summer is when the real malaise will set in. So what now? We know that global demand will return eventually. The key for the sector is surviving this down period without packing up and leaving town. Cash flow, cash is king. Cash flow is the most critical short-term challenge for manufacturers. Manufacturers who have temporarily laid off staff under the new relaxed EI rules and the wage subsidy program will soon run out of time. Temporary layoff periods give manufacturers a few months to wait out the slow period before they have to make a decision or not to bring workers back or not. If they can't bring the workers back, the sector will face a pretty significant severance liability this summer that's going to make the cash crunch a little worse. So that's why CME, my association, fought hard for supports for manufacturers to try to bridge the gap. Wage subsidies, rent supports, relaxed labor rules are all necessary to help ensure most of the sector lives to see a better day. And I'm happy to tell you that it looks okay in Saskatchewan right now. So today I wanted to flag some trends that we see happening in the future for Saskatchewan. I thought we'd look at one particular trend. Scott touched on it in his presentation that's beginning to emerge around global supply chains. Weeks before the coronavirus outbreak was labeled a global pandemic by the World Health Organization, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Western Canadian manufacturers were already feeling the symptoms. Wuhan, the capital city of the Chinese Hubei province, as you all know by now, endured a pretty horrific COVID-19 outbreak. Many manufacturers saw their once pretty reliable supply chain start to wobble. Wuhan's key industries include optoelectronics, steel manufacturing, petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals. Companies like Honda, Shanghai GM, Citroën, Renault all have significant operations in the city. In fact, just for an idea of the scale of the place, in 2016, Wuhan hauled in an estimated $22 billion US in foreign direct investment. That's $22 billion for one city in 1 year. Eventually, Wuhan completely shut down, and the effects were felt around the world. A similar scenario played out when Italy began to fail under the weights of the pandemic. albeit to a lesser extent. But Italy is a known exporter of steel products, many of which are imported into Alberta and Saskatchewan for mining and oil and gas purposes. But the COVID-19 pandemic shines a bright light on the extent to which Canada and the manufacturing sector as a whole is exposed to global supply chain disruptions. And I'll give you a bit of an example. There's a really prescient blog post published more than a year ago by Toronto doctor Iris Gorfinkel. And she raised the alarm around Canada's reliance on China for most active ingredients in Canadian drugs. She pointed out that the last penicillin manufacturer in North America closed its doors in 2004. Local drug manufacturers simply can't compete with state-owned and highly subsidized Chinese corporations. So one of the bright lights shining through this catastrophe is that once we're through to the other side, governments and manufacturers will be taking a long, hard look at reliance on foreign manufacturers. But I got to say, it's a really dangerous conversation. It's dangerous because there are going to be knee-jerk calls for extreme forms of protectionism that, if reciprocated by our global competitors and our global trade partners, our local exporters would be hammered. And as a general rule, the benefits of free trade outweigh the risks. But so there is a compromise, we think, as we move forward to recovery. Saskatchewan policymakers need to reflect on how exposed we truly are to global supply disruptions. When it comes to public procurement, so building infrastructure, roads, bridges, hospitals, schools, we need to look at how chasing the lowest bid possible undervalues the long-run value of strong local supply chains. Saskatchewan companies, and I'm talking about the big players. So you look at oil and gas, mining, petrochemicals. They need to take an honest look at their procurement practices and determine if the lowest bid wins is always the best policy in the long term. They may find that a little extra investment up front in nurturing local supply chains, or at least options, local supply options, pays off consistent dividends down the road. The Saskatchewan economy will be, of course, focused on restarting over the next few months, but eventually the dissection of our crisis response, how future crises can be prevented, is going to begin in earnest. And we have to resist the temptation of protectionism. It's already actually kicking in as we speak, as the Western provinces are looking for ways to get out of the New West trade partnership. And their hearts are in the right place. They seek to find a way, if there's public money, economic stimulus spending that's to happen, then local companies ought to be the beneficiaries of that. Example being, if the Saskatchewan government, and they already have announced a significant stimulus spending program, if those construction projects go to Alberta or Manitoba firms, that's probably not ideal. The problem is, once we start opening up these trade deals for a one-off exemption, it's hard to get back to what was originally a good idea, that the provinces should seek to find the best bid for public procurement projects. But that conversation is underway as we speak. But we need to embrace the benefits of global trade and competition, while at the same time reassessing the value of local supply chains. We need to ensure that the cost of things like global pandemics, natural disasters, wars, are adequately priced into our reliance on foreign sources for essential products. So I think that's going to be a big conversation in the coming year. But I want to close by revisiting a fundamental challenge facing all Canadian manufacturers. And it's made more acute and more clear now post-pandemic, or we're getting close to being able to say post-pandemic. We know the science shows us, the economic data shows that the strongest indicator of manufacturing growth is investment in equipment and technology. The higher the investment rates around the world, the brighter the future for the sector. In terms of investment in technology, Canadian manufacturers have been steadily slipping in global rankings, and Saskatchewan is no different. It's a trend. It's a nationwide trend. We are still a top echelon global manufacturer. We are still producing high value products, and we're exporting them around the world. But countries like India and Singapore have slid by global rankings, slid by Canada in global rankings. And it's not just a competitive advantage around labor anymore. They're moving up the food chain as well. Every year they do more specialized, more advanced manufacturing, and that strategy is starting to pay off for many countries around the world. This is the one trend that we need to reverse above all else. And to do that, we need all hands on deck. We need to look at how we tax investment in this country. We need to look at how we treat the development and commercialization of intellectual property, how our academic institutions are contributing to the innovation cycle. Are we getting value for money on our public dollars that we spend on R&D in Saskatchewan? In the meantime, CME's been working really closely with manufacturers across the country on how to succeed in the coming months as we reemerge from the pandemic. We continue to host free webinars and policy calls each week. Some of them have been extremely well attended. We had one policy call that had 900 participants from across the country. Every Tuesday and Thursday, we do additional calls. Some of them are very specific to how manufacturers operate. For example, our COVID resource page at CME's website is one of the best around. It's some great practical information for manufacturers on things like workplace hygiene, how to handle a positive COVID case in your staff, that sort of information that is essential, especially for SMEs. Some of the larger companies are very advanced in this space, but some of the small and medium-sized enterprises across Canada, this is new country, new territory for them, and we're trying to help them out. So if you could, I know you guys all have significant networks in all your communities. If you could share the CME COVID resource page, that'd be terrific. And we'll continue to use that to help our industrial clients. So with that, those were my comments, and I'll hand it back to Verona for any questions.
Thanks, David. That was very interesting and informative. Back to CME then, I have to plug our network into the association a bit more, and I'll do that. Is it membership based then? All of your manufacturers do have to be members?
Yeah, we're a membership-based not-for-profit. We have about 2,000 members across the country. In Saskatchewan, we do a significant amount of continuous improvement, lean training. Mm-hmm. We also run a very successful manufacturing consortium that has some of Saskatchewan's best companies.
Okay, well, I'll do more diligence on that. In terms of policy moving forward, then it's a bit concerning to hear about the advanced technology issue. Is that, again, if you had to prioritize, what is CME focused on right now in terms of priorities?
Well, our priority right now is around temporary programs around COVID, but our number one policy recommendations, well, number one and number two is technology investment. How can government policy help stimulate or incentivize investment in technology and equipment? Because one of the, if you look at statistically, if you look at a Saskatchewan manufacturer, say Vaterstad, manufacturer of air seeders, and you take that identical company in the United States, statistically, the American company will be 3 times better capitalized, better equipment, more investment, and a lot of that is really just access the size of their local market. Mm-hmm. So Canadian companies have to kind of overcome a small market disadvantage. And so I think, unfortunately, it makes my free market heart break, but I think we need government help and it's about tax policy. It's about incentive programs. Saskatchewan government is rumored to be rolling out an incentive program for manufacturers, and a significant one, to invest in automation, robotics, and software. That's the right kind of program. and we're looking for that across the country.
Okay, I've heard rumors as well, so I look forward to hearing those announcements soon. Are any questions from our participants for either of our speakers today? Both were so informative. I'm definitely going to push this recording out next week when we fine tune it to our market. I've learned a lot on my own. Scott, are you still with us?
I am, and I've been learning so much from David, and I don't know how he presented. It looked like he memorized everything. I'm so jealous.
Yes.
Reading off my notes, but that was fantastic, David.
We've got some comments here, very good presentations, very informative. I'm going to have to refer back to them myself so I can support our base, and good comments. We're always trying to reinforce here to focus on your existing investment, focus on your existing business space for diversification. I just had that conversation with some community leaders yesterday, and because I don't feel we're still trying to attract that new investment. It's just sort of human nature, I think. So thanks for emphasis on that, and on the procurement issue as well. That can be drilled all the way down to even local municipalities who not always, on a buy local basis. And that's another message that we've been trying to get out. So thank both of you for all of your prep and your presentation, and take care. And I look forward to working with both of you in the future.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.